Alright, this is Mr. Chandler. This is part one to get you ready for Animal Farm. You're going to use the PowerPoint / my voice to fill in these notes, okay? So every time I say write this down or highlight it, it means it is to be found on your notes. So let's start with a quick review. This is not on your notes, but from last time. We said in the last class that an allegory is a story of symbols. That's right. An allegory is a story of symbols. And some of the most famous uses of allegory were the parables used by Jesus in order to teach using secret code. We went over a couple examples of parables, stories that really didn't happen, but they were used to teach messages, kind of like an allegory. We also said that an allegory can be used to teach something, that's right, very important to someone who is very small. That's right, one more time. An allegory can be used to teach something very important to someone very small. Think of that book, The Great and Terrible Things. We use that to teach the Holocaust to very small children. We can teach them pretty much everything that happened through an allegory, through that story about bunny rabbits, squirrels, porcupines in the forest. Okay? Now, some of the most famous examples of allegory, and other than that children's book, obviously, are what we're going to read, which is Animal Farm. Another one we mentioned was Famous to Kansas, The Wizard of Oz. And the other one we brought up was The Chronicles of Narnia. All of these are allegories where they teach stories through symbols. Okay? Alright, not on your notes, but this is very, very important. Think of an allegory like an iceberg. Okay? Icebergs are very small at the top, but underneath the surface there is lots to them. And that is exactly what our story is going to be like. We're going to read the tip of the iceberg, or the top. We're going to read Animal Farm. But remember, it's not really about animals. It's actually about a real story, a bigger story, the rise and fall of USSR, of the Soviet Union. So we're going to go through the story, no doubt, but we're constantly going to be connecting it to, now wait, that really happened with Joseph Stalin. Wait, that really happened with Tsar Nicholas II. So as we read, keep connecting it to what really happened, because it's a story of symbols. Alright? Now, this is where your notes actually start. The roots of George Orwell's Animal Farm, we call this the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Okay? First part of your notes. If I highlight it, you mark it. Here we go. This starts, the time period is actually the early 1800s. That's on your notes. And it happens in Europe. Now, if at any point you need to pause, feel free to pause this, get caught up. Now, in this story that takes place in Europe in the early 1800s, there are two major characters. There are those who own the factories, or factory owners, those who work in the factories, or the factory workers. Those are your next two blanks. Alright, next slide. Now, it all starts with this. The exposition of our story is the Industrial Revolution, and that is your next blank. The Industrial Revolution looks, well, it looks like this, folks. You have lots of factories that completely change cities. Workers come in, very, very poor people who do menial work for very little money. The cities get very, very dirty, very polluted, but they're very busy, and we are able to make things much, much faster. It all started with the Industrial Revolution. Okay? You do not have to write these down. These are just cool. There are four things that really take place in the Industrial Revolution. We get better power. We start using coal and water. Think of steam engines to move large objects. Instead of just shearing sheep, okay, we use cotton to replace wool for cloth. That's faster. Our transportation improves. We have better roads. We actually use the railroads. This speeds things up. And of course, factories. We figure out how to make things using machines to speed up the work and, for the most part, make it better. But here's the result once again. Large, dirty cities. When you see this picture, remember, Industrial Revolution. Alright? Again, you don't have to write those down. You do have to write these down. Next three blanks. Three major effects. Women and children become factory workers. Kind of sad, right? That's right. That's who ends up in the factories. This is a weaker workforce that can't take care of itself. And finally, urbanization. And you'll probably want to take down some notes about what urbanization means. It really means workers leave the country and go to the city. Cities get filthy and crime-filled and large, and the wealthy people move out to the country. Urbanization is just that. Lots of jobs in the city for poor people, and the rich people move out away from the city because of what the city becomes. So again, three blanks. Women and children become factory workers, weaker workforce, urbanization. Pause if you need to catch up. Now, Initiating event, this is your next blank, is what we call capitalism. Now look at this picture and you get a good sense of what capitalism is. You have one person who's very rich and very wealthy who controls everybody else. Now, you have a lot of money that's taking place. This man is making lots and lots of money, but for the most part, most of the workers make very, very little money. So capitalism allows us to do whatever it is that we want with money. The government is not allowed to touch it. But as a result, you end up with a few very, very rich people and many, many poor people, or in some cases, middle class people. So when you hear capitalism, think of this picture. When you see this picture, think of capitalism. All right? Now, this causes conflict. We'll get to that. Capitalism defined as this. It's the idea that a nation's economy must run without interference from the government. Okay? Government is not allowed to touch the money. You might jot that down in the margin. Money run without interference from the government. So let's say that you own a bunch of gas stations. And let's say that you have the best gas, and after a while the other gas stations go out of business. You can literally charge $20 a gallon, and the government is not allowed to step in and say, wait, you can't do that. Because in real capitalism, government cannot tell you how to run your business or what to do with your money. Okay? Capitalism. Now, first point of conflict. These are your next blanks. First point of conflict, because there's no interference from the government, there are no rules regarding minimum wage. Okay? There is a lack of rules. And as a result, people worked long, long hours. That's your first blank. There are no rules about the number of hours that you work. Remember, if I go too fast, pause it. Next one. There are long hours and low wages. Okay? Long hours and low wages. Factory owners get very, very rich. And what they do is they pay the government. You could write down bribery is another problem. Factory owners don't want the government to mess around with their businesses, so that's what happens. They pay off the government. Corruption and bribery. Now, I know you only have 3 blanks, but if you want to add some more in, that's fine as well. No social mobility. In other words, if you were born poor, you were going to stay poor, even if you worked in a factory. In other words, wealth belongs to a very small percentage of the population. Most people are poor, and very few people are wealthy. Last one, this is just kind of a cool one, or interesting rather, poverty skyrockets. Now, as a result, poor people get very, very disgruntled. They start to resent the government. Now, you only had to write down 3. You can pick which of those 3 you want to write down. Obviously, pick the ones that you think are more important than the others. Alright, rising action. So what do you think happened so far? When you've got a bunch of poor people who are really, really angry, and there are many of them, what could happen? Remember that scene in A Bug's Life, when all the ants figure out there are more of them than the grasshoppers, and at the end they take over? That's the potential of what could happen. Alright, so here we go. Let me rattle these off, and then you can pick 3. These are things that happen because of the terrible conditions. The factory conditions actually get dangerous. There are lawsuits. People sue the factories, but interesting, the government doesn't do anything because they're being bribed. Sabotage. That's one of my favorite words. Can you say it? Sabotage. That's right. Sabotage means people are actually destroying machines in the factories on purpose. And there are also riots. Now, the problem with these riots is a lot of times they get really, really violent. The factory owners hire thugs or actually hurt the crowds and say, look, we're just protecting our property. And the government actually agrees. So the problem with these riots is they're violent and deadly. So factory conditions are dangerous, lawsuits, sabotage, and riots. Now, just so you know, resentment against the factory owners does turn towards resentment against the government. That's kind of a bummer. Now, as a result of all this, this is the guy we turn to. This is the guy whose name you write down. His name is Karl Marx. Famous, famous writer. Now, write down his name. Remember, when you see this guy who looks kind of like Santa Claus, very smart, very dignified, that is Karl Marx. This is who the poor people are going to turn to. Now, I think you have the next 3 blanks say some facts about Karl Marx. Here are a bunch of them. Just pick 3. He was born in Germany, so he is from Europe. He's well studied, literature and philosophy. He travels through Europe, and he observes the situation of the working class, so he has kind of watched them to see the problems. He settles in London. He is a writer of political and economic philosophy. Now, this is one you have to write down. He is an idealist. Make sure you get that one written down. That's a person who sees a way to make the world better. That will be on your test. An idealist is someone who sees a way to make the world better. Now, it's interesting he's actually funded by the wealthy, his friend. So, write down a few facts about him. What I think are probably the most important are these. He's well studied. He's observed the working class. He's an idealist. I also think it's kind of ironic that he's funded by the wealthy. The poor people are actually going to turn to a rich person for help, which is kind of ironic. But he does seem to understand their plight or their problems. Alright, here we go. Next set of blanks. He writes this essay, gets everybody fired up. It's called the Communist Manifesto. That's your next blank. Communist Manifesto. Alright, now, where does that word come from? The title actually comes from this. Commune, this is your next blank. It's a group of people who share everything. You don't own anything. Therefore, ideally, everybody's equal. So a commune is a group of people who share everything, and in theory, everybody's equal. Manifesto actually means just a document, or a public declaration of principles and philosophy. You can just write down document in that blank. Okay? So it literally means a bunch of people sharing, we wrote it down on paper. That's what he writes. He comes up with this great idea that instead of ownership, instead of factories and factory workers, what if we just shared everything? And he writes it down on paper, and people start to love this idea. Now, what happens, though, as a result is this. We end up with the knowledge that there has been a struggle forever between two groups of people. They are the, let's get a highlighter, felt tip pen, the bourgeoisie. Oh, my pen's not working. We'll try something else. The bourgeoisie and the proletariats. So here you go. Bourgeoisie are these people. Bourgeoisie are the rich owners who have it nice. The proletariats are the people, the masses of people who do most of the work. And what Marx points out is if you look back through time, these people have always been fighting. The rich people fight to stay in power and to control the poor people who do all of the work. Now, on your notes is what you write down is this. Bourgeoisie. Those are the owners. The employers. The capitalists. They're the ones that own everything, upper class. I would write those in next to bourgeoisie. Okay? Pause at any point if you need it. The proletariat. Those are the people who own nothing, but they work to produce for the bourgeoisie. So you can just put the workers. They own nothing. Okay? Working class. So they're doing all the work. Bourgeoisie. The way I remember that is it sounds very fancy and wealthy. The bourgeoisie. Proletariat. It just sounds a little rougher. But you can also shuffle up P-R-O. And you get P-O-R, like poor. So think of the proletariat as the poorletariat. And the bourgeoisie as the fancy. Alright? Now, in this document that he writes, Marx accuses the bourgeoisie of reducing the family to a relationship based on money. I'm going to go through these real quick and then we can pick some. Replacing local businesses with large corporations, so your little businesses can't survive. It has to be big ones. Think of like Walmart taking over your local store. Destroying the worker's sense of identity, turning him into some sort of piece of a machine, so he feels like he's actually part of the machine instead of a person. He also says this makes countries become dependent on trade, or trading with other nations, and also forcing, he accuses the wealthy of forcing the world to accept their way or collapse into poverty. Now, basically, he accuses them of being responsible for sabotage, riots, and violence that takes place all over. So these are your notes, right? Marx accuses the bourgeoisie of what? Let's see. Making a worker feel like a machine, so they're not a person anymore. What's another good one? Reducing the family relationship to something based on money. In other words, a lot of people would have more and more kids so they could put them in the factories instead of doing anything else, so that the kids could earn more money so the family could actually survive. Okay? Now, you can also put this down. He also blames them. He blames the factory owners and the rich people for being responsible for riots, sabotage, blames them for the violence. Those are probably pretty three good ones. Alright, here we go. Climax. Alright, what's happening is, as a result, he says, let's overthrow the bourgeoisie. Let's get rid of those capitalists, those money mongers, and let's replace them with communists. Now, when you think of the word communist, you probably have heard it in a negative connotation. We think of countries that we don't like. Now, just hold that thought. Let's show you what it really means, and we'll let you make your own judgment. Okay? Now, communism. Communism defined is, well, it's this. Look at the picture, and what do you see? The idea is that people share everything. They share the land, they share the factories and the products, and they also share the money. One of the first lessons we teach you as children is you need to share. Okay? And that makes sense. Communism in theory is this. Now Marx says, though, let's get rid of the rich people and replace it with communism. That's one reason why people don't like it. Because it involves taking power away from one group and then giving it to everybody else, sharing it out. Now, communism itself, this is what you need to write down. Communism is a government in which property is owned by the nation instead of individuals. Each citizen works for the common benefit. This is what I write down. Government is owned by the nation. I messed that up. Let's back up. Back up. Let's try it one more time. Okay, communism. This is what you write down. Government where property is owned by the nation. That's what you run right down. Instead of individuals. And everybody works together. So there you go. Government in which property is owned by the nation. Everybody shares everything. And everybody works together. Good blank, or good definition for your blank. Now next one. Let's see. Now here's the reason. Now, the communism doesn't sound bad at all. When we actually looked at it, it looked all happy, people sharing. The reason why it freaks a lot of people out is this. Two disturbing aspects of communism are that no religion. Karl Marx saw that religion would actually be a way to keep poor people poor. And you could justify this by saying, like, look at what Jesus' most famous beatitude / Sermon on the Mount stuff is. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It makes it sound like you could read those scriptures or whatever and say, look, religion's just a way to keep poor people poor and happy. And that's what Marx saw. He said we shouldn't have religion because it just keeps people poor and happy. That freaks a lot of people out. The other thing that freaks people out is there would be no liberal arts. In other words, all literature, music, and drama, you couldn't even participate in those at all unless they're like the ideals of communism. Does that make sense? So you would read a book about communism. The music would be about communism. The plays you'd go to would be reenacting the most famous scenes of communism or whatever. And so, no religion and the liberal arts, literature, music, drama, all those things would be controlled or would have to contribute to communism. And that's what freaks a lot of people out. That's just a lot of control or, some restrictions. Now, climax, Communist Manifesto basically says this. This is a line from the document. Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare their ends can be attained only by forcible overthrow of all existing sociable conditions. Notice forcible overthrow. Communism means we have to literally get rid of the people in power. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite! Now, if you read this and you were rich, this would freak you out. The proletariats are going to rise off and break off their chains. It sounds like everybody you control is going to take you over. And so that got a lot of rich people, a lot of bourgeoisie freaked out. They knew the proletariats were coming. Following action, how would you respond if you were bourgeoisie? Would you get the heck out of Dodge? Would you get your guns together? Would you actually talk to the proletariats and see, well, what is it that we can do to help you out so you don't take us over? Well, this is what happens. Okay. Business people and politicians realized that Marx was definitely right about one thing. They were outnumbered by an angry and potentially powerful working class. Think of A Bug's Life. A few grasshoppers in charge of many, many ants. And now the ants know that they are greater in number. So they start listening to the problems of the workers in the lower classes. Here are your notes. Okay, let's read through them, and then you can fill in a couple. Okay, let's see. New reforms rose up in a few wise nations. They passed laws regulating wages. That would be one. They actually set minimum wages. It said you can't pay anybody any less than this. They also passed laws that regulated hours in a work week. You weren't allowed to work people 80, 90 hours a week. They might take it down to like 40, 50, or 60, for example. Now, they actually let workers form unions, which was new, to negotiate contracts. So this would have been one of the first times in our country where people were able to come together and say, no, this is what we want, and they talk to the owners. Now, this is one you definitely need to write down. This is where public schools come from, folks. One of the concessions, one of the decisions was, all right, let's take kids out of factories, or at least give them the option of going to school. That way we can teach them to grow up and be great capitalists. So public schools actually form as a result of this. So those are your 4 blanks. Resolution, this is what happens, okay? It actually splinters into 2 groups. You have communists, and these are the ones who want a violent overthrow, and I would write those words down. Violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie, okay? So they're going to say, look, we want it to take place now, so we're going to throw you out. We might even kill you. Communists. There's also another group, though, that agrees with Marx, and those are the socialists. Okay, these are the next part of your notes. Those are who fight for workers' rights, but they want it through peaceful legislation. In other words, they want to use laws. So your notes would say something like this. Communism, violent overthrow of bourgeoisie. Socialist, peaceful legislative reform. In other words, pass laws to get rid of them and to redistribute it, basically. So this would be kind of the slow, happy group. This is the get it done now group. And that's another reason why communism, the word itself, freaks people out. Let's see. And it says, last blank, the socialist government is actually known as brilliant socialism. Okay? Now, final remarks. Your notes are done, but you still have a couple things to do, so watch this. Resolution. In nations that do not ignore Marx, the workers get rights and power, and the owners get to stay alive. So if you listened to Marx at the time, you lasted longer in power. The problem is, in nations that do ignore Marx, and that's what Animal Farm is about. It's going to be about Russia that ignores Marx. The workers get more and more hateful and resentful, and they're willing to do anything to change their lives. The owners themselves are happy and wealthy for a little while, but what's going to happen is this group is going to lose it, and they're going to rise up and overthrow this group. And that's the story of Animal Farm. It's about Russia, a nation that ignores what the workers want, and as a result, pays the price. Now, so next time we're going to talk about the rise and fall of the USSR. Okay? Now, final thoughts, this. This is how you can tell if you actually got it. If you go to your notes, they'll be all filled in, obviously. Study those. You'll have the option of using those on your quiz, but you'll also be able to do what we call a picture walk, and a picture walk goes like this. You should be able to look at the picture and tell me everything there is to know about this. So you'd have to look at this picture and say, okay, an allegory is like an iceberg. There's a story we read on the top that is Animal Farm, but the real story we're learning about is the big story on the bottom, and that's the story of the rise and fall of the USSR, of Russia that becomes this powerful, powerful country for a little while. So you have to be able to look at this and say how an allegory is like an iceberg, and give that example. You'd have to look at this picture and say, this is the Industrial Revolution, and tell me everything about the Industrial Revolution. So look at that picture and tell me everything you can remember about the Industrial Revolution. And what you should have said was something like this. The Industrial Revolution is when cities changed completely. We had factories that moved faster. We had better power, better transportation. We had cotton instead of wool. What else did we have? I'm trying to remember. Factory workers end up doing a lot of the work, but we use machines to do it. And as a result, our cities became very, very dirty, very, very crime-filled, and the rich people moved out. So good for business, bad for the city in a lot of ways. You'd have to look at this one and say, ah, yes, this is capitalism. Now think of everything you remember about capitalism. You'd have to say something like, well, capitalism is when one or a few people control most of the wealth. And there are many, many poor workers. The government itself doesn't step in because it realizes that this is how the economy runs. Capitalism is, once again, government does not interfere. A few rich people own everything, and many, many poor people do all the work. Then you have to look at this picture and say bourgeoisie and proletariats. Bourgeoisie are the rich owners, and they are the ones who are in charge of the proletariats, the poor workers who do most of the work. Last 2 pictures in your picture walk. Who's this guy? Looks like Santa Claus? That's Karl Marx. He is the guy that the poor people turn to. He writes the Communist Manifesto and gets everybody excited about changing capitalism into something more like this picture, communism. So you have to tell me what communism is. On paper, communism is this. We all work together. We all own everything together. So the government is a government where everybody shares the land, shares the factories and what is produced, as well as the money itself. And folks, that is a picture walk. So you should be able to look at each one of these and tell me, mm, 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 and mm. Alright, folks, and that is the end of part 1 of Animal Farm.